Hello, my name's Stuart. I'm the curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon, and it's my pleasure again to be here with you for another one of these Cromwellian conversations. Yet again, I'm afraid I'm recording this from home rather than inside the Cromwell Museum because of the coronavirus outbreak. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the museum itself, so using some images of the museum to try and illustrate some of the things I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of our wonderful historic building where we're located, a little bit about how the museum itself came about, a little bit about what we're here for, and some of our amazing collections as well. So just to give you a flavour of what the museum is and hopefully whet your appetite so when the coronavirus outbreak is over, you'll perhaps want to come and visit us. So the museum is located in the centre of the historic market town of Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire, and we've got this amazing, beautiful building which is right in the centre of the town on the main market square. It's actually the oldest building in Huntingdon. Parts of it date to about 1160, when it was originally constructed as a medieval monastic hospital, thanks to funds that were given to the town by David, Earl of Huntingdon, who was actually a member of the Scottish royal family. It was a hospital run by the Augustinian canons. Now, when I say a hospital, I'm not talking quite the same thing as we are today. It was literally a building that provided hospitality as opposed to medical treatment necessarily to travellers. And the idea was that any travellers travelling through the centre of the town on the Great North Road, which ran right through the middle of Huntingdon in those days, what is today the modern High Street, and anybody who, for instance, couldn't afford to stay at one of the local inns or taverns could get a meal and a bed for the night at the local monastic hospital, in return for which they were expected to join in, of course, with the monks' prayers. Now, it remained property of the Augustinian canons until the 16th century. It passed over by the mid-16th century, around the time of the Reformation, to the proper ownership of the town council. And by 1565, the hospital had been closed. Much of the buildings and the complex had been demolished, and what was left is the building, more or less, that you see today, although at that time it looked very different because it was covered with brick cladding, and there was an internal floor had been added as the building was turned into the town's grammar school. It was called the Huntingdon Free School, not in the sense that it was necessarily free of charge, but it was providing education to the sons of the freemen of the town. So this was anybody who was from a relatively wealthy or well-connected background in the town, boys only of course, could get an education at the school, primarily what we would call a classical education, so most of the lessons conducted in Latin, things like history, Latin, Greek, mathematics, Bible study, to prepare the boys for an education at either Oxford or Cambridge University. So amongst the boys who received an education at the grammar school, both Oliver Cromwell, who was of course born in the town of Huntingdon, just up the street from where the museum is today and spent over half his life here, and also Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, who was moved out of London at the beginning of the Civil War by his family, went to live with relatives over at Brampton and received a couple of years of education at the Huntingdon Grammar School. So two very famous old boys in the 17th century, just a few years apart from each other. The building continued to be owned by the grammar school up until the 1950s, and then it became the Cromwell Museum. There'd never been really an impetus to commemorate Cromwell in Huntingdon for a long time, for the simple reason that the town was actually a bit embarrassed by him. Back in the 19th century, the town was very high church in terms of its views, and unlike St Ives down the road, which was much more nonconformist and therefore quite proud of its links with Cromwell and actually put a statue up to him, Huntingdon kind of therefore tended to sort of brush over connections with its most famous son. That all changed in the 20th century, particularly in 1958, when an exhibition was held in Huntingdon Town Hall of items borrowed from collectors and various other collections to commemorate the 300th anniversary of Cromwell's death. The exhibition proved to be so popular that a campaign was raised to create a permanent museum to him in the town, and it opened inside the former grammar school in 1962. The museum continued to be run by the local authority up until 2014. At that point, unfortunately, due to budget cuts, the county pulled out from supporting the museum. However, a campaign and support from the county council allowed the museum to be re-established as an independent charitable trust. So today, the museum is run by the Cromwell Museum Trust. We're an independent charity, and we rely very much on the support of our visitors and donors in order to enable the museum to continue. I'm delighted to say in the last year or so we've had some great improvements thanks to grants funding from AIM Biffa, Wolfson Foundation, the Huntington Freeman's Trust. This last autumn we were able to refurbish for the museum for the first time in over 30 years, enabling us to tell Cromwell's story much more effectively, but also to put more items on display, use new technology, and hopefully bring the story to life for a much greater number of visitors. Unfortunately, we opened only 1st of March, and then only 2 weeks later had to close with the coronavirus outbreak, which was unfortunate timing to say the least. But at least we managed to get it open, and hopefully when this is over you'll get the opportunity to come and have a look and enjoy the new look museum for yourself. We do have the best collection in the world of items relating to Oliver Cromwell. Our job is to tell the life and times of Cromwell, his story. We're not his fan club. Our job is not to sort of airbrush over or be apologists for him in any way at all. Our job is to tell his story honestly and fairly and allow visitors to make their own minds up about him. We do try and tell his story, to coin a phrase, warts and all. So whilst we recognise there's some things that are positive about him, there are some very dark chapters in his life story that are very controversial, and we don't shy away from that. The collection, as I say, is quite remarkable. Around about 2/3 of it belongs to the museum. About 20% of the collection is on loan to us from Cromwell's descendants, which of course items that have been passed down through his family over the last 300 years have a remarkable provenance to them, and therefore we can say with a great deal of certainty, or at least with certain surety, that they actually did belong to him or are associated with him. These include several of Cromwell's swords, both his battle swords and a ceremonial sword worn whilst he was set up as Lord Protector. The hat that he is reputed to have worn when he dismissed Parliament in 1653. His medical chest, which allows us to talk about the various medical conditions that he suffered from. This beautiful Florentine chest, which was given to him as a diplomatic gift in 1656 by the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and many other personal items and portraits relating to his family as well. We have a large amount of documentary material relating to Cromwell and the Civil Wars, some very, very personal letters. This one, which has been only recently on display for the very first time, was written by him in 1652, and is Cromwell talking about his depression, something he suffered from in bouts throughout his life, and is quite a moving letter in its own way as well. We have a number of items on loan to us from the Royal Armouries, particularly arms and armour, that allows us to talk about the sort of Civil War when, of course, Cromwell first came to prominence, and also items on loan to us from other collectors and from other museums, including the Museum of London, into the bargain. We have an amazing collection of portraiture, so not just of Cromwell himself, but many of his family, his contemporaries, the people who were significant throughout this period of history, by some of the best-known artists of the mid-17th century. So these include people like this life-size portrait of Cromwell, which is quite remarkable, and also one of the original copies of Sir Peter Lely's portrait of Cromwell, which is reputedly, of course, the one that he asked to be painted warts and all. So we've got one of those portraits as well. We also have lots of commemorative items. These relate to how Cromwell has been interpreted through the centuries after his death. And these include all sorts of things, everything from sort of different views of pictures of Cromwell, things like political cartoons and so forth, right down to commemorative items. It's amazing how many people have produced everything from commemorative busts and items like that, through to even a bottle of Cromwell gin, which is sold by Lidl, by the way. So all sorts of items throughout the collection, and it's designed to sort of give an overview of Cromwell's story and his significance, and as I say, allow visitors to explore this particularly significant and turbulent period in our history. So that gives you a little bit of an overview about the museum. Hopefully, once the coronavirus outbreak starts to be lifted, you'll get the opportunity to do come and have a look, particularly to see what we've done with the place in terms of refurbishment. And in the meantime, we'll be continuing doing more videos about Cromwell, about the museum, about our collections, about this fascinating period of history. And we'll hope to see you again soon. In the meantime, please stay safe, please stay well during this particularly strange and distracted times in our modern history, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.